The SS were the ultimate architects of terror. They built an empire on order, precision, and mechanized death. They documented everything. They kept meticulous records of their atrocities. But deep in the classified archives of the Third Reich lies a secret so dark, so completely unhinged, that even the SS tried to burn the evidence. They built a military unit so violently out of control that the German High Command didn't just want them disbanded, they wanted them executed. Imagine a force so psychotic, so heavily populated by the absolute worst dregs of humanity that the most ruthless empire in history looked at them and felt genuine fear. This isn't a story of military strategy. This isn't a tale of generals moving pins on a map. This is a story of a monster slipping its leash. The Third Reich was built on the idea of racial and societal purity. They locked away anyone they deemed undesirable. They emptied their maximum security prisons. They unlocked the asylums. They pulled men from solitary confinement, handed them SS uniforms, gave them fully loaded weapons, and told them they were the law. And the High Command thought they could control the chaos. They believed they could harness pure, unadulterated madness and point it at their enemies. They were dead wrong. The architect of this nightmare was a man named Oskar Dirlewanger. By every metric of Nazi society, Oskar Dirlewanger was a total outcast. He was a violent drifter, a disgraced World War I veteran. During the First World War, he fought in the trenches. He inhaled poison gas. He was wounded multiple times and awarded the Iron Cross. But when the guns fell silent in 1918, Dirlewanger's mind did not return to peace. The war had broken something deep inside his brain. He could not integrate into civilian life. He joined the Freikorps, roaming the streets of a broken Germany, engaging in brutal, bloody street brawls. But his descent was only beginning. He wasn't just a political fanatic, he was a deeply disturbed criminal. In the years leading up to the Second World War, his crimes escalated. He was convicted of offenses so degenerate, so morally bankrupt, that the Nazi Party itself expelled him in disgust. He was stripped of his military medals. He was thrown into a prison cell. Society had completely rejected him. He was officially labeled a criminal psychopath, meant to rot in the dark forever. But monsters often find patrons in dark times. Dirlewanger had one highly placed friend from his days in the trenches, Gottlob Berger. And while Dirlewanger was sitting in a prison cell, Berger had been climbing the ranks of the Nazi Party. By 1940, Berger was one of the most powerful men in the SS. He was the head of the SS main leadership office, answering directly to Heinrich Himmler. Berger was in charge of recruiting, and he had a massive problem on his hands. The Eastern Front was turning into a meat grinder. Operation Barbarossa had stalled. The endless, freezing forests of Eastern Europe were swallowing German soldiers whole. Regular German troops, trained for conventional warfare, were bleeding out in the mud, hunted by invisible Soviet partisans who struck from the shadows and vanished into the trees. It was a phantom war. Berger told Himmler they needed a different kind of soldier. They needed men who knew how to hunt. They needed men who were comfortable in the deep woods, operating outside the law. He proposed a radical idea: comb the prisons of Germany for convicted poachers. Criminals who knew how to track, how to survive, and how to kill without hesitation. Send them into the Russian forests. If they succeed, they earn a pardon. If they die, nothing is lost. It was a cynical, disposable equation. Himmler, desperate to secure the rear lines, agreed. He handed the disgraced Oskar Dirlewanger a battalion of convicts and told them to clean the forests. At first, they were known as the Oranienburg Poachers Battalion, just a few hundred men with hunting rifles. But the Eastern Front wasn't a normal war. It was a slaughterhouse of biblical proportions. The scale of the violence, the vastness of the Russian steppes, the absolute lack of oversight changed things. Dirlewanger realized something dangerous. He was operating in a lawless void, thousands of miles away from Berlin's bureaucracy. There were no reporters. There were no rules of engagement. There were no limits. He didn't want to just hunt partisans anymore. He wanted a private army. His unit was taking heavy casualties in the partisan war. The poachers were dying. He needed reinforcements, but there weren't enough poachers left in German prisons. So Dirlewanger sent a terrifying request back to Berlin. He asked to drop the requirements. He didn't want poachers anymore. He wanted the absolute worst society had to offer. He wanted the murderers, the violent felons, the criminally insane, the men locked away in the darkest, deepest cells of the Reich. And Berlin, desperate for manpower, approved it. The doors of the darkest institutions in Germany swung open. Trainloads of men arrived at Dirlewanger's camps in the east. These were men who had been chained to walls, men who had committed unspeakable acts of violence against civilians in peacetime. They were stripped of their prison stripes. They were handed the terrifying black uniform of the SS. The psychological shift was instant and catastrophic. You take a man who has been locked in a cage because he is too dangerous to exist in society. You give him a rifle. You give him ultimate authority over life and death. And you tell him that violence is no longer a crime, but a duty. The unit mutated into a rolling storm of terror. They stopped fighting the enemy army and started erasing entire landscapes. They didn't just burn villages. They orchestrated theatrical displays of cruelty. They locked populations in barns and set them on fire. They treated the Eastern Front like a massive, unrestrained hunting ground where human beings were the prey. And the regular German army noticed. These were hardened Wehrmacht generals, men who had overseen the brutal conquest of Poland and France. Men who were entirely complicit in a war of annihilation. But when they saw how Dirlewanger's men operated, even they recoiled in absolute shock. The atrocities were so gratuitous, so entirely divorced from military objectives, that it disgusted the regular army. Frantic, desperate reports flooded into the high command in Berlin. Army commanders demanded the unit be immediately removed from their sectors. They argued that Dirlewanger's men were tactically useless. If they encountered hardened Soviet troops, the convicts broke and ran. They were cowards in a real firefight. But worse, they were breaking the minds of regular German recruits. Young soldiers who were forced to witness Dirlewanger's atrocities were suffering psychological breakdowns. The brigade wasn't just a military failure, it was a contagion, a disease spreading through the ranks of the German army. The SS prided itself on cold, calculated discipline. Dirlewanger's unit was a chaotic, bloody embarrassment. The SS decided it was time to cut the infection out. They dispatched SS Judge Konrad Morgan to the Eastern Front. Morgan was a strict, fanatical legal investigator for the SS, a man whose job was to root out corruption. What he found when he audited Dirlewanger's unit terrified him. He uncovered a mountain of evidence regarding unauthorized killings, massive corruption, theft, and sheer anarchy. Morgan drew up the paperwork. He demanded Dirlewanger's immediate arrest, a court-martial, and an execution. This is the ultimate mind-bending paradox of the story. The SS, the very architects of the Holocaust, the men running the death camps, were trying to execute one of their own commanders because they deemed his methods too evil, too uncontrollable. The paperwork was signed. The firing squad was practically waiting. But Dirlewanger had an ace up his sleeve. Gottlob Berger intervened. He intercepted the reports. He stood in front of Himmler and protected his friend. Berger argued that the sheer, unrestrained terror Dirlewanger inflicted was a strategic asset. He claimed it paralyzed the partisan networks with fear. The twisted logic of terror won the debate. Dirlewanger wasn't shot. He wasn't arrested. He was promoted. His unit was expanded into a full brigade, and they were given a unique collar patch to distinguish them from the rest of the SS. 2 crossed hand grenades, the universal symbol of pure, explosive destruction. That patch changed everything. When the convicts sewed those crossed grenades onto their collars, a massive psychological barrier snapped. They knew the regular army hated them. They knew the SS judges had tried to execute their commander. But they also knew that the highest levels of power in Berlin had stepped in to protect them. They realized with terrifying clarity that they were completely untouchable. The rules of war, the rules of humanity, no longer applied to them. All consequences vanished into the smoke of the Eastern Front. And then came the summer of 1944. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of a two-front war. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. The massive Soviet army was rolling inexorably toward the borders of Germany. In August, the Polish Home Army launched the massive Warsaw Uprising. It was a desperate, heroic attempt to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. The city erupted in violence. The German garrison was caught completely off guard, bleeding out in the narrow streets. Adolf Hitler was enraged. He viewed the uprising as a personal insult. He issued a catastrophic order. Warsaw was to be completely leveled. Every building, every monument, every human being. The city was to be wiped from the face of the earth as a permanent warning to the rest of Europe. To execute an order of such absolute, merciless destruction, the German High Command needed a unit with zero moral compass. They needed men who would not hesitate to pull the trigger on the innocent. They sent the Dirlewanger Brigade. When the penal brigade entered the smoking ruins of Warsaw, the nature of the battle changed instantly. It was no longer a military operation, it was an extermination. The Polish Home Army had prepared for a fight against soldiers. They had dug trenches, built barricades, and secured firing lines. They were not prepared to fight a horde of armed psychopaths. Dirlewanger's men moved block by heavily contested block. They didn't use infantry tactics. They used terror. They used anti-tank weapons to clear civilian hospitals. They threw grenades into basements packed with refugees. The regular German soldiers fighting in adjacent sectors were once again paralyzed by the sheer depravity of what they were witnessing. The crossed grenades became a symbol of apocalyptic dread. A highly decorated German sapper commander, a veteran of years of brutal frontline combat, officially went on the record. He formally refused to allow his engineers to operate alongside Dirlewanger's convicts, stating he would not let his men be spiritually contaminated by such madness. But amidst the burning rubble of Warsaw, the fatal flaw of the crossed hand grenades was finally exposed for all to see. They were absolute masters of terror against the unarmed, but they were completely incompetent soldiers against a determined enemy. The Polish resistance realized very quickly that surrender to Dirlewanger meant a horrific death. So they fought back with a lethal, desperate efficiency. They turned the ruined buildings into fortresses. They ambushed the convicts in the narrow alleys. The inmates of the penal brigade had no idea how to coordinate suppressing fire. They didn't understand flanking maneuvers or urban warfare tactics. They simply charged blindly into the kill zones, and they were slaughtered. The casualty rate within the Dirlewanger Brigade during the Warsaw Uprising hit a staggering 200%. This mathematical impossibility was achieved because the unit was constantly being replenished on the fly. Fresh trainloads of inmates were being shipped directly from the remaining German prisons straight to the outskirts of Warsaw. They were pulled off the train cars, handed rifles, pointed toward the smoke, and sent directly into the meat grinder. Many died within hours of arriving, their bodies piling up in the streets. Through it all, Oskar Dirlewanger commanded the chaos. He didn't use a radio. He didn't use tactical maps. He stood amidst the sniper fire, directing his horde with a riding crop and sheer manic energy. By the time the uprising was finally crushed, Warsaw was a graveyard of ash and stone. The Dirlewanger Brigade had achieved its dark objective, but the unit was a hollowed-out shell. The prisons of the Reich were completely empty. There were no more psychopaths left to recruit. In a desperate bid to keep the unit alive, the SS started forcing regular political prisoners, communists, and standard military disciplinarians into the brigade. It was a fatal mistake. These new recruits were completely horrified by the veteran killers of the unit. The brigade began tearing itself apart from the inside. Mutinies broke out in the freezing camps. Men waited for the dead of night and deserted into the frozen woods, preferring the risk of freezing to death over spending another day wearing the crossed grenades. The iron grip Dirlewanger held over his men began to slip. And then the calendar turned to 1945. The Soviet Red Army unleashed its massive winter offensive. Millions of battle-hardened Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and endless artillery, shattered the German lines. The Eastern Front collapsed completely. The surviving remnants of the Dirlewanger Brigade were thrown directly into the path of the advancing Soviet armor. It wasn't a defensive line, it was an execution sentence. The Soviet intelligence units knew exactly who the Dirlewanger Brigade was. They had seen the ashes of Warsaw. They had seen the slaughtered villages of Belarus. The order among the Red Army was unspoken but absolute. The Soviets took no prisoners from the men wearing the crossed hand grenades. When the Soviet armor hit the penal brigade's lines, the unit evaporated. The convicts realized the war was lost, and their uniforms were death warrants. A frantic, macabre ritual took place in the freezing forests of eastern Germany. The survivors tore the identifying patches off their collars. But they had a bigger problem. As members of the SS, they had their blood group tattooed under their left arms. It was a permanent mark of the beast. In the freezing dark, men violently carved the tattoos out of their own skin, using hunting knives, shards of glass, and even battery acid scavenged from destroyed vehicles. They stripped the clothes off dead civilians and regular army soldiers, desperately trying to shed their true identities. They rehearsed fake names and fabricated backstories. Then, they joined the endless, chaotic columns of displaced refugees, trying to outrun their own ghosts, hiding in plain sight among the very people they had spent years terrorizing. But what about the architect? What about Oskar Dirlewanger? He had been wounded in the final weeks of combat and evacuated to a hospital in the rear. When Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, he knew he was the most hunted man in Europe. He discharged himself, changed into civilian clothes, and vanished into the massive displaced population. He was a ghost, moving through the ruined cities of a shattered empire. But his luck finally ran out in June 1945. In a small town in southern Germany, a former concentration camp inmate recognized his face. The scars, the gaunt features, he was unmistakable. He was quickly arrested by French occupation forces and thrown into a local detention center in Altshausen. The official historical records from the French authorities state that Oskar Dirlewanger died of a heart attack in his cell a few days later. That is a documented lie. The prison in Altshausen was guarded by a contingent of free Polish soldiers fighting under French command. These were men who had lost their families, their homes, and their country to the Nazi war machine. And they knew exactly who Oskar Dirlewanger was. They knew exactly what he had orchestrated in the streets of Warsaw. Over the course of several nights, the Polish guards entered his cell. The man who had operated without rules, without oversight, and without consequences for years was finally trapped in a locked room. The French authorities allegedly turned a blind eye, ignoring the screams echoing from the cell block. Over multiple nights, Dirlewanger was subjected to a severe, relentless beating. He was beaten to death on the cold floor of a prison cell. A brutal, unceremonious end for a monster. But the nightmare didn't die with him. As the war ended, the surviving architects of the SS went into panic mode. The Nuremberg trials were approaching. The SS High Command desperately wanted to present themselves as a legitimate, honorable military force that was simply following orders. The Dirlewanger Brigade was the ultimate proof that the entire system was fundamentally corrupt. The existence of a penal unit made of serial killers and psychopaths completely shattered their defense. So they scrambled to burn every document, every transfer order, every personnel file proving the unit ever existed. They tried to erase the crossed grenades from history. And while the leaders burned papers, thousands of Dirlewanger's surviving convicts were slipping through the cracks of a broken Europe. The Soviet filtration camps caught many. Soviet interrogators were brutal and thorough. They stripped German prisoners in the freezing cold. If they found a fresh, jagged scar under a man's left arm, or if an alibi fell apart under intense interrogation, that man was pulled from the line. There were no tribunals. There were no courtrooms. They were marched silently into the snow-covered woods, and only the Soviet guards returned. But thousands of these men fled west. They reached the American and British occupation zones. The Western Allies were entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of humanity. Millions of prisoners were crammed into massive holding pens. The interrogators were exhausted, and the convicts of the Dirlewanger Brigade played the system perfectly. They were hardened criminals. They knew how to lie to authority. Sitting in interrogation chairs, they claimed to be regular army cooks, supply clerks, low-level conscripts who had never fired a weapon. The Allies, eager to rebuild Europe and shift their focus to the looming Cold War, processed them through. The most dangerous psychopaths in Europe walked out of the Allied POW camps holding standard discharge papers. They were entirely free men. This is the most chilling aspect of the entire saga. They didn't vanish into the shadows. They went back to normal life. Men who had been pulled from asylums, men who had burned cities to the ground, integrated seamlessly into the booming post-war economy of West Germany. They became bakers. They became car mechanics. They delivered the mail. They married, had children, and joined local community clubs. For decades, the innocent citizens of West Germany lived side by side with mass murderers holding a clean slate. There was no public registry. There was no warning to the neighbors. The monsters were mowing their lawns. It wasn't until the late 1960s and 1970s that a new generation of German prosecutors, unburdened by the guilt and complicity of their parents, began digging through the forgotten, half-burned archives. Slowly, methodically, they realized the sheer scale of the lie. They started hunting down the surviving members of the brigade, but the legal system was completely unequipped to handle a nightmare of this magnitude. When these men were finally dragged into courtrooms, they didn't look like the terrifying enforcers of the Third Reich. They were frail, elderly men wearing cheap suits and thick glasses. They played deaf. They claimed their memories had faded. They used the very democratic legal system they had once fought to destroy to shield themselves from justice, hiring expensive lawyers who tied the prosecutors up in endless, agonizing procedural delays. Most of the witnesses were long dead. The physical evidence was ash. Many walked away entirely acquitted. The ultimate tragedy of the Dirlewanger experiment is not just that it happened. The tragedy is that it was largely successful in its final objective of evasion. The system created a weapon of pure, unrestrained terror, unleashed it upon the innocent, and when the war was lost, allowed those same men to dissolve safely back into the crowd. They lived the long, comfortable, peaceful lives that they had violently denied to tens of thousands of others. They died quietly in warm beds, taking the darkest secrets of the Second World War with them into the grave. If this journey into the hidden shadows of history changed the way you view the past, make sure you are subscribed. There are countless more stories buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, question everything you have been taught.